waiting a little bit. This is Faith McDonald from Cathartismos Global, and after posting 4 articles on the kgiglobal.org website about September 11th that were retrospectives on 9/11, I figured that people might think I'm a wee bit obsessed. So rather than post another article that was an article about my own personal experience on September 11th, I thought that I would do a video of it instead. It's now September 14th, of course, but September 11 deserves to be remembered all year long, not just on 9/11. So this is my experience on 9/11/2001 that I call the end of illusions. And I'm just going to read to you the article that I wrote about that back in actually 7 years ago for Front Page Magazine. Well, 5 days before the jihadists that we came to call the 9/11 terrorists commandeered American airplanes and crashed them into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a Pennsylvania field. It was the same kind of beautiful sunny day in Washington that it was on that horrible day. On that sunny September 6th, 2001 day, former U.S. Senator John Danforth became the first ever U.S. Sudan Special Envoy with the mandate of trying to bring peace to that war-torn nation. For decades, the Islamist government of Sudan had been attempting forcibly to Islamize and Arabize all of Sudan and waging genocidal jihad against those African Christians, Muslims, and followers of traditional religions from the south, the Nuba Mountains, Blue Nile State, and elsewhere that resisted. Sudan's so-called civil war had already resulted in the death of over 2.5 million people, mostly civilians, and the displacement of over 5 million. Danforth was sworn in by President George W. Bush in a White House Rose Garden ceremony to which dozens of diaspora Sudanese and their American activist friends, including me, were invited. Excitement was palpable that day. Since taking office, President Bush had made Sudan a priority. We made him make it a priority. He spoke out against what he called one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters. He acknowledged the complicity of the Sudanese government, and he attempted to circumvent the orchestrated starvation of their own people by changing USAID's methods of food distribution. And he also agreed to appoint a special envoy that would be his own personal representative on U.S. Sudan policy to talk directly to the president on Sudan policy. We were full of hope that the appointment of Jack Danforth could eventually lead to a peace agreement that would bring about an end to the bombing, starvation, slavery, and other methods of jihad being used by the government of Sudan against its own citizens. There were no illusions that this would be easy or quick in coming. The real work was just beginning as we tried to see a piece of legislation, the Sudan Peace Act, passed in the Congress. But although everyone was united that day in the appointment of the Sudan Special Envoy, the State Department, no fooling, was opposed to the stringent measures in the legislation. They particularly disliked an amendment sponsored by U.S. Representative Spencer Bachus from Alabama, God bless him, that had already been passed by the House of Representatives, and it was to invoke capital market sanctions against companies doing business with the government of Sudan. And so in the following days, following the swearing in, as Special Envoy Danforth reviewed his portfolio and familiarized himself with the horrors taking place in Sudan, we worked in a coalition to strengthen U.S. Sudan policy and pass the Sudan Peace Act with those sanctions, those capital market sanctions, intact. As Congressman Bachus himself told the late heroic journalist A.M. Rosenthal, this is what Congressman Bachus said: expanding U.S. sanctions in the area of capital markets access specifically targets what is the most significant revenue the Sudanese government has to prosecute the war. Obviously, the United States must send a new message, and we must make that message stick. Stop the killing, stop the murder, stop the torture, end the terror, or we end the investment. Can't have it both ways. It is immoral to finance a war machine you know is wrong. America has to walk the walk. Thank you, Congressman Bachus, for saying that. In addition to opposing the immoral financing of a regime committing terrorism against its own people, we were convinced that the Sudanese regime was complicit in global terrorism and jihad. While some members of Congress also believed this and said so at House hearings, successive administrations, Clinton, Bush, Obama, continued to prefer the fantasy that the Sudan regime was a good faith partner, both in cooperating in the war on terrorism and in dialoguing with their own victims in South Sudan. Kind of like the Taliban today in Afghanistan. Good faith partners. Intelligence received from sources on the ground in Sudan pointing to the regime's connections to terrorists around the world were constantly downplayed or denied. So our Sudan coalition planned to publicly endorse at a press conference the House version of the Sudan Peace Act over the more watered-down Senate version. We were convinced that it was needed to stop genocide in Sudan and to help stop global Islamic terrorism. The event was to be in the Rayburn House office building at 9 a.m. on Tuesday, September 11, 2001. In a cab, almost at the Rayburn building, I heard on the radio that a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. In those days, before we could conceive of the evil of which the Islamist agenda was capable, even I, familiar as I was with the atrocities taking place in South Sudan and with the persecution of Christians in the Islamic world, assumed it was some horrible accident. Up in the Rayburn building, International Relations Committee hearing room, though, things became clear. All the other speakers and Sudan coalition members' eyes were riveted on the television screen when I got there. News came that a second plane had crashed in New York. We who so often reported on Russian Antonov cargo planes dropping bombs on starving South Sudanese civilians waiting for their food distribution, and women and children abducted and branded like cattle, had seen this level of monstrousness in Sudan, but never before in our own country. Not long after that, we heard that a plane was headed towards Washington, D.C., probably targeting the White House or the U.S. Capitol. We were ushered quickly out of the room by Capitol Hill police. The congressional offices were all being evacuated and closed. No one knew what was happening. We surely couldn't conceive that two more planes full of our fellow citizens would be used against us as weapons by the terrorists, or that Americans on one of those planes, forcing a crash in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, would precede our valiant military troops in doing battle against the jihad. In the midst of shock, my only continual thought was how clear it all was now, that now they would get it. Now they would understand what was really happening in Sudan, because it was happening here too. I'm not sure I even knew what I meant by them getting it. I had not yet begun to articulate even to myself the problem that I saw with U.S. Sudan policy beyond the fact that it needed to be strengthened. It took 9/11 to make it clear that what was taking place in Sudan was being treated as a humanitarian issue by the U.S. government, and that the root cause was never addressed. It was the same root cause that we saw in the suffocating smoke, burned flesh, incinerated body parts, collapsed towers, and obscene, yawning chasms that indicated that we had crossed a line in history from which we could never return. I hoped that the policymakers would now somehow understand that to deal with Sudan's genocide as a humanitarian crisis was as absurd as to deal with 9/11 as merely a random criminal action. Even before we learned the magnitude of 9/11, we understood that this was a deliberate attack on us for who we were and what we represented. Not less was this then, and still at that point when I wrote this article, true in Sudan, possibly still amongst certain parts of society, where the regime was attempting to eradicate the culture, identity, and the very lives of all those who resisted the imposition of a pure Arabist Islamist identity. But U.S. Sudan policy did not reflect that reality. It still doesn't. Still doesn't, really. Every success in U.S. Sudan policy, the passage of the Sudan Peace Act, the North-South Peace Process, the North-South Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the CPA, and finally, South Sudan's referendum on secession leading to an independent nation of South Sudan, has happened in spite of the absurdity of negotiating in good faith with a regime that operates through denials and deception. Failure to stop the still ongoing genocide in Darfur, still ongoing, even after all the changes that have taken place in Sudan. To fully implement the CPA, to speak out for Sudan's other marginalized African ethnic groups like the Bija of eastern Sudan and the Nubian civilization in the far north, and particularly in those days to protect the people of the Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile State, who were once again under active genocidal war, have occurred because the regime has never been held accountable for violating and dishonoring decades of agreements. No, and they still were never held accountable. Just suddenly they became the good boys of the U.S. when things changed because of the protests on the streets in Khartoum and other cities. But they never had to be accountable for killing all the South Sudanese. That September morning, people flooded out of the city and then remained for hours without moving on every street and highway. I spent most of the day lying in the hatchback of a two-seater sports car, as four of us who had been at the press conference, including my own sister and the national commander of the Salvation Army and the woman who owned the sports car, my friend Lisa Thompson, attempted to travel back to Virginia. Soon we had news of the plane that crashed into the Pentagon. When we heard of the plane headed for D.C. that went down in Pennsylvania, we knew that those brave passengers well may have saved our lives. I will never forget September 11, 2001. It is with me always. Remembrances of more innocent times are marred by the knowledge that they were before. I wish we could go back to a time when we were naive. I wish we had not been rudely awakened to the kind of world that the people of South Sudan and now of Afghanistan knew as reality, that the people of the Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile State experienced for years. But on 9/11, I understood the irrevocable nature of what had taken place, and even before U.S. troops set off for battle in Afghanistan and then Iraq, I knew that nothing would ever be the same.